For 30 years, he lived among us as a shadow unseen, untouched, and undefeated. But now the silence is broken, and the ghost who once ruled through fear has finally vanished. The sky above Castelvetrano is a quiet kind of blue, the kind that makes even the birds fly slower. Somewhere beneath that sky, on a narrow street warmed by Sicilian dust, a boy is born. His name is Matteo. His full name, Matteo Messina Denaro, doesn't mean much yet, but one day it will hang in the air like smoke. For now, he is just a baby wrapped in cotton and watched closely by a man the town calls Don Ciccio. Don Ciccio doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to open his jacket. His eyes do the talking, and the silence around him does the rest. He is not the mayor, not a priest, not a judge, but people nod when he walks by. And when they speak his name, it is always in half volume, like a prayer or a curse. Matteo grows up in this silence, in a house where curtains are drawn even during daylight, and visitors know to knock only once. The walls are thick, so are the secrets. As a child, he hears stories not from books, but from murmurs that slide under doors. He learns early that some questions are never asked, and some names are never repeated, especially not when his father is in the room. He is a quiet child, but not shy, sharp, curious. He watches everything, the way his father shakes hands with men in suits, the way envelopes change hands after church, the way fear sometimes dresses itself up like respect. At school he is polite, not loud, not soft, just present, like a shadow that always knows where the sun island. By the time Matteo turns 10, he already knows how to disappear into a room. By 12, he understands that power is not always the loudest voice but often the calmest one. His teachers say he is intelligent. His neighbors say he is polite. The other children say nothing at all, because children, more than anyone, know how to sense danger before it has a name. At home, Don Ciccio teaches him not just how to move through the world, but how to bend it. Not through shouting, not through violence, at least not at first, but through knowing things others don't, through remembering what others forget, through favors that can't be returned. The lessons are unspoken, but not unclear. And in the slow heat of a Sicilian afternoon, Matteo Messina Denaro begins to understand something deep in his bones. That in this world, some people build houses, others build silence. And some, like him, are born with the blueprint already written behind their eyes. They called him Don Ciccio, but his real name was Francesco Messina Denaro. To Castelvetrano, he was more than a man, he was a climate, a presence that pressed down on the town like summer heat on olive groves. And Matteo, his son, didn't grow up in that shadow. He was forged in it. Don Ciccio wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His voice was gravel and calm, like a shovel dragging through dirt. When he sat at the head of the table, no one reached for wine until his fingers moved. When he passed through the piazza, old men stood a little straighter. The local butcher once said that Don Ciccio could silence a barking dog just by looking at it. No one laughed, because no one doubted. Matteo was still a boy when he realized his father was not like other men. Most fathers worked, came home, kissed their wives, and wore worry on their faces like sweat. Don Ciccio came home calm, always calm. He never looked rushed, never looked scared. He made decisions over espresso and buried problems where even the earth forgot them, and people listened. Carabinieri captains, judges, bankers, priests. Not all at once, never in public, but they listened. Because Don Ciccio held a ledger in his mind full of debts and promises, he didn't shout to be heard. He whispered so others leaned in, and when they leaned in, they belonged to him. For Matteo, this was not a legacy to be admired. It was an expectation to be met. There were no bedtime stories in that house, only lessons disguised as silence. He learned that a look could carry more weight than a word. That loyalty wasn't about love, it was about debt. That fear, when used properly, was a form of respect. At family dinners, Matteo watched his father's hands, thick-knuckled, slow-moving. Those hands never trembled, even when bad news arrived. Matteo watched how his father greeted men with double kisses and dismissed them with a nod. He paid attention to who was allowed to speak first, to who laughed the loudest, and to who never returned. Being Don Cicio's son meant never being ordinary. Other children dreamed of football or motorbikes. Matteo learned how to read a room before he learned how to read a map. He learned who owed what to whom before he ever studied history. His world was not made of fairy tales. It was built on silence, steel, and stone. And as he grew, the townspeople began to say his full name a little slower. Matteo Messina Denaro. Like they were already preparing to fear him. Like they knew a bloodline doesn't stop, it evolves. And Don Cicio's shadow? It didn't fade. It stretched and wrapped around the boy like a second skin. The streets of Castelvetrano were never quiet. Not really. Vespas sputtered past fruit stalls, radios crackled love songs from half-open windows, and shopkeepers called out prices like actors in a play that never ended. But underneath all that noise, there was something else, a tension, a silence too heavy to name. And Matteo, even as a child, could feel it pressing against his chest like a hand. He had quiet eyes, not dull, just observant, the kind of eyes that held questions but rarely asked them. While other boys shouted and chased soccer balls through dusty alleys, Matteo watched. He watched how grown men looked over their shoulders before lighting a cigarette. He noticed which neighbors never made eye contact, and he saw how some doors never opened at night, no matter how loud someone knocked. There were rules in those streets, but no one wrote them down. You just knew. You knew not to talk about what you saw. You knew which cars to avoid. You knew that sometimes a man vanished not because he moved away, but because he'd said too much. Matteo didn't need explanations. He breathed those rules the way others breathed air, silently, constantly. He learned early that survival wasn't about strength. It was about timing, about knowing when to speak and when to stay still. He knew the weight of a stare. He knew the chill that followed a name spoken too freely. At school, he answered when called, but never more. At church, he folded his hands like a saint but listened like a soldier. The world taught him patience, and he paid attention. At home, the silence was sharper. It was not the warm kind. It was the kind that filled rooms like smoke. His father spoke little, but when he did, Matteo remembered every word. Not because he was afraid, though fear was always part of it, but because words in that house were rare, and rare things have power. Sometimes at night, he'd hear voices rise outside, followed by the sudden hush of closing shutters. The streets grew loud with footsteps, and then quiet again, as if the town itself was holding its breath. By morning, the market would open like nothing happened. Fish laid out on ice, bread warm from the oven. But something was always missing. A man, a car, a sense of peace. Matteo never asked about the absences. No one did. Not his mother, not his teachers, not the priest. That was how Castelvetrano worked, loud on the surface, quiet where it mattered. And Matteo, with his silent footsteps and sharp eyes, was learning to move through it like a shadow, never startled, never seen, just there, watching, waiting, becoming. They say it happened when he was still a teenager, maybe 16, maybe younger. No one agrees on the exact year, and no one dares to ask. Because the truth in places like Castelvetrano isn't carved in stone, it's whispered, passed from mouth to ear like a confession no priest wants to hear. It started, like many things do in that world, with a problem, a man who forgot his place, a shopkeeper maybe, or someone who had spoken when he should have stayed silent. What matters is that Don Ciccio didn't move. He didn't send his usual men. He sent his son, Matteo. They say the boy didn't hesitate, that he didn't flinch, didn't sweat, didn't blink. He walked into that quiet street with a calmness that didn't match his age, and he came back with a name crossed off an invisible list. No shouting, no chaos, just a lesson written in red. There were no police reports, no trial, just a ripple that moved through the town, a door that stayed shut, a widow who never spoke, and a teenage boy whose eyes seemed darker the next morning. Rumors crawled like insects after that Matteo had cleaned the weapon himself, that he had eaten dinner afterward as if nothing had changed, that his father hadn't said a word to him but had poured 2 glasses of wine instead of 1. The older men at the barbershop stopped calling him the boy. The girls in town lowered their voices when he walked by. His teachers no longer pushed him to speak in class. It wasn't that they knew anything. It's that they sensed it. Something had shifted. The shadow behind his name had grown teeth, and from that moment on, he belonged to a different world. A world where silence was sacred, and violence was not a loss of control but a tool of precision. He had stepped across a line most never even saw. There was no ceremony, no applause, just a shared understanding. He was his father's son now in every way that mattered. No one knows how he felt about it. Whether he cried alone later, or whether something inside him went still. But people began to say something else after that. That Matteo Messina Denaro didn't just follow in his father's footsteps. He moved faster, cleaner, colder. And so the legend began. Not with riches, not with power, but with a name removed from the world, and a boy who never looked back. They didn't raise him to follow. Not in that house, not under that name. From the beginning, Matteo Messina Denaro was being shaped for something bigger than obedience. He wasn't just born into the Cosa Nostra, he was being carved into its future. Don Ciccio saw it early. The way Matteo listened without blinking. The way he remembered names, patterns, debts, and favors like they were stitched into his skin. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it landed like a quiet stone dropped into deep water, and in their world, that was worth more than gold. There were dinners where men twice his age leaned in to hear his thoughts, not because they had to, but because they were already learning to respect him. He understood power before he could grow a beard. He knew when to press, when to retreat, and when to stay absolutely still. His instincts weren't taught, they were inherited. By the time the 1980s rolled in, the old bosses were looking over their shoulders not just for the police, but for the next generation. And Matteo didn't just knock on the door. He was already seated inside. Young, yes, but sharp. Dangerous in a way that didn't shout, didn't flash. He didn't need theatrics. His reputation did the heavy lifting. He didn't play at being a soldier. He studied everything: banking, construction, drugs, arms, politics. If the mafia needed money, Matteo knew how to make it. If it needed silence, he knew who to pay. And if it needed a message, he knew how to deliver it without leaving fingerprints. They called him Diabolik, after a comic book anti-hero who stole, vanished, and always smiled while doing it. Matteo didn't mind the nickname. He understood the value of myth. He let the stories grow around him like vines, half true, half fear, fully useful. The old dons began to pass his name with a certain tone. Not casual, not careless. It was a mix of curiosity and concern, because Matteo was not just loyal, he was ambitious. He moved through the hierarchy like smoke through a cracked door, silent, shapeless, and impossible to stop. There are men who inherit power and let it rot in their hands. Then there are men like Matteo who take what they're given, sharpen it, polish it, and turn it into something terrifying. He wasn't satisfied being a prince, not when the throne was already in sight. And so, long before the headlines knew his face, long before the government plastered his name across billboards, the Cosa Nostra already knew who he was. Their golden sun, their silent storm, not the future of the mafia, but its evolution. At first, it was just a whisper. A name passed between lips like a warning, like the hush before a thunderclap. In the cafes of Castelvetrano, men would lower their voices when they said it. In Palermo, it was muttered behind cigarette smoke. Matteo Messina Denaro, not loud, not yet, but coming. He was young, far too young by the old rules. The mafia was a world of grizzled men, of weathered hands and tired eyes, but Matteo moved differently. He was quick without rushing, calm without stillness, and every move he made left a mark, even if no one saw him make it. The killings were not messy, they were precise. A man found slumped in a car, another gone missing after breakfast, a third collapsed just after Mass, the echo of the shot still ringing beneath the church bells. No one saw Matteo, but everyone knew. His reputation spread like oil on water, slow at first, then unstoppable. He was the kind of name you didn't say unless you had to, the kind of name that arrived in town 2 days before he did. Older mafiosi began to nod when his name was mentioned, not because they liked him, because they understood him. He wasn't reckless, he was surgical. Where others made noise, he made arrangements. Where others took what they wanted, he made you give it willingly, or think you had. His early years were littered with men who crossed the wrong line, spoke to the wrong person, or forgot who held the balance sheet. And yet, there was no trail, no signature, only rumors. Some said he kept a notebook of every insult and debt, written in a code only he could read. Others claimed he'd studied the art of war, finance, psychology. The truth was, no one really knew what Matteo studied, only that he applied it. By the time the 1980s bled into the 1990s, his whisper had become a name, a full name, Matteo Messina Denaro, and it carried a weight that made even the boldest men pause. He had not just earned his seat, he had made it seem as if no one else ever belonged there. And still, he rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to, because fear, when built correctly, doesn't come from shouting. It comes from the space between what people know and what they imagine. Matteo lived in that space, moved through it, ruled it, and so the whisper grew. It grew until it was no longer safe to speak it at all. He didn't learn from books, not the kind you find in libraries. Matteo's education came from blood and silence, from men who smiled as they buried their enemies beneath lemon groves, from meetings where lessons were written in the way someone lit a cigarette or tilted a glass. His was the school of ghosts, and the teachers wore suits that never wrinkled, and shoes that never squeaked. They were the old guard, men who had survived the wild storms of Palermo, who had watched friends vanish in the back seats of cars, who had outlived judges, rivals, and sometimes even their own sons. These were not men who talked about the past. They carried it like shrapnel in their bones. And Matteo? He listened. He sat in dim rooms thick with cigar smoke, where the air was heavy with names that could never be spoken outside. He watched how decisions were made with nods, not words. How justice, in that world, was measured in silence, not in courts. He learned the value of patience, how to make someone wait long enough for fear to do the work. One of his first mentors was said to have once ordered a killing by simply folding his napkin twice. Another, known only by a nickname no outsider dared repeat, taught him that kindness was the most effective disguise, that a man who gives bread with one hand can still hold a knife in the other. They didn't praise him. They didn't need to. They saw in Matteo what Don Ciccio had already known: he didn't just belong in this world. He was born to shape it. He had no need to prove himself. That had been done the moment he chose not to flinch when others bled. From these ghosts, he learned that leadership isn't about volume. It's about memory. Who helped you? Who crossed you? Who hesitated when your name came up? And he remembered everything. But there were darker lessons, too. The kind no one teaches directly. The kind you absorb just by being in the room. That cruelty, when used correctly, could feel like mercy. That loyalty bought with money fades, but loyalty bought with fear that lasts. And that sometimes, to lead, you had to disappear. By the time he walked out of that shadowy apprenticeship, Matteo Messina Denaro no longer moved like a student. He moved like someone who had already become the teacher. But he didn't rewrite the rules. He simply made them quieter, colder, cleaner, And the ghosts, who had once taught him? They started lowering their voices around him too. By the time Matteo reached his 20s, he wasn't just a killer. He was something far more dangerous. He was educated, not by professors, but by power itself. He had completed the mafia's version of higher learning not in lecture halls, but in back rooms where the walls could hear. Politics, finance, blood. That was the curriculum. He learned early that bullets might silence a man, but money could erase entire investigations. A well-timed handshake could do more than a car bomb. Matteo didn't just inherit the family business, he refined it. He understood that the future of Cosa Nostra wasn't only in Sicily's back streets, but in banks, courtrooms, and political offices where men wore tailored suits instead of leather gloves. There were whispers that he had friends in Rome, that certain officials owed him favors they'd never speak of, that a judge's cousin suddenly owned beachfront property no one remembered being for sale. Matteo didn't walk into politics like a beggar. He entered like an investor, quiet, calculating, and already holding the keys. But he never left the shadows completely, because behind every deal, every contract, every smile across a dinner table, there was still the threat, the quiet reminder that this young man who knew how to move money also knew how to end lives, and quickly. His business grew not just drugs and extortion, but construction, retail, even art. He understood how to launder wealth until it gleamed like legitimacy. A company on paper could be worth millions, even if it only existed in a drawer. That was Matteo's gift. He made the invisible profitable, but he never forgot the other side of the coin, the one soaked in blood. While some men tried to go soft with age or power, Matteo remained sharp, efficient. Names still vanished under his watch. Warnings were still issued in ways that didn't need words. And when violence was necessary, it came with precision, not passion. There was a rumor that he once had dinner with a politician and ordered a killing between the second course and dessert. No raised voices, just a napkin dabbed at his mouth and a subtle glance. The man was gone before the wine reached room temperature. This was the mafia's graduate program. Matteo didn't just pass it, he rewrote it. Where others relied on tradition, he adapted. Where others leaned on fear, he added strategy. He became the kind of man you couldn't simply arrest or kill, because by the time you found him, you were already part of his system. And so the line between criminal and kingpin blurred, between outlaw and executive, between myth and man. And Matteo? He walked that line like it was a tightrope he'd built himself. He had the smile of someone who knew everything but said nothing. Matteo Messina Denaro was not the snarling brute of old mafia stories. He was elegance in a tailored jacket, charm in dark sunglasses, danger wrapped in perfume and leather seats. He could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they were the most important person there. And yet, when he left, no one could quite remember what he had said. He understood early that violence made people talk, but charm made them forget. In Sicily, where traditions ran deep and suspicion deeper, Matteo learned to disarm with gestures, not just guns. He kissed hands, poured wine, remembered birthdays. But behind every kind word was a ledger. He smiled, not to be liked, but to be underestimated. They say he had lovers in every province, daughters of judges, actresses, even the niece of a senator. He wasn't reckless with women, he was strategic. Each relationship gave him something: cover, information, access. And if a romance ended, it ended clean. No scandals, no headlines, just a whisper of perfume left in the air, and a new number stored in his phone. He was seen in luxury hotels under false names, dined in seaside restaurants where the staff never asked for ID, and drove cars that changed color as often as his location. People swore they had met him but couldn't describe him. That was his magic. He made an impression without leaving fingerprints. In photographs, when they rarely surfaced, he looked more like a businessman than a boss. Stylish, relaxed, often laughing. But his eyes? They told another story. Still, cold. like the ocean before a storm. No matter how warm his smile, those eyes never smiled with him. He read newspapers obsessively, not for news but for names. He followed gossip, stock markets, foreign politics. Knowledge was power, and power, he believed, was best used without being seen. That was his genius. He didn't want fame. He wanted reach, influence without presence. To shape the world like wind shapes, stone, slowly, invisibly, and forever. As his crimes grew, so did the myths. Some said he had plastic surgery. Others claimed he never stayed in one place more than a night. But most believed something simpler, that Matteo didn't need to hide because he had already become a ghost, a man who existed only in consequence, not in form. And when people remembered him, if they remembered him at all, it was the smile they spoke of, that perfect, practiced smile, the one that made you forget until it was far too late. He didn't make friends the way other men did. Matteo Messina Denaro built loyalty with silence, sealed it with favors, and tested it with funerals. In his world, the dead spoke louder than the living, and every grave dug was not just a warning but a promise. He knew which funerals to attend, and more importantly, which ones to skip. Sometimes, his absence meant more than flowers. Sometimes, just a glance at the widow was enough to remind everyone who had the final word. In Sicily, where death is folded into tradition, Matteo moved like a priest of shadows, blessing the living by honoring the dead. Some of his closest allies were sons of men he'd buried, not always because he wanted to, but because he had to. In that life, loyalty wasn't inherited, it was reborn from necessity. A man would kneel beside his father's grave, and Matteo would offer him two things, protection or purpose, sometimes both, and that was how his circle grew. He remembered every name carved into marble, not out of sentiment but out of strategy. Each death meant something, a debt closed, a favor paid, a silence kept. He built his empire like a cemetery organized, watched over, and filled with stories that could no longer be told. It was said that if you betrayed him, your name was already being etched in stone before you even knew you were in danger. But if you served him, truly served him, your family would be taken care of long after your hands stopped working. That was the trade. That was the oath. Blood in, silence forever. In the dark circles of Palermo and Trapani, men spoke of him as if he were already gone, like he was part ghost, part legend, part undertaker. He makes friends with the dead, one man whispered in a bar, because they never talk back. And he was right. Matteo didn't just inherit power, he buried anyone who questioned it. He built loyalty with funerals, favors, and fear. He didn't inspire love, he inspired remembrance. And in that world, remembrance was stronger than affection. There was no room for sentiment, no space for guilt, just graves, and the men who stood over them with hats in hand and secrets in their chest. Matteo didn't ask for trust, he expected it. And those who gave it lived a little longer, sometimes a lot longer. But those who didn't, those who wavered, who talked, who hesitated, well, they joined the choir of the dead. And Matteo, the silent friend to every one of them, never missed a beat. In Sicily, the line between politics and organized crime isn't drawn in ink, it's drawn in blood. And Matteo Messina Denaro understood that better than anyone. He didn't storm the halls of power. He didn't need to. He simply whispered through their walls, like smoke curling under a door. Quiet, invisible, and impossible to keep out. They say there were senators who owed him more than votes. Judges who looked the other way, not because they were afraid, but because they were already part of the machinery. The truth is, in southern Italy, it's not always about who's elected. It's about who's protected. And Matteo protected many. He knew where the money went, where it was laundered, where it landed, who took a cut. He funded campaigns without leaving fingerprints, paid for favors without signing his name. Politicians didn't need to know his face, they just needed to know that if they made the wrong choice, A friend might disappear, or a relative's shop might burn. There was a rumor, never confirmed, that Matteo once had a list of names locked in a safe. Not just enemies, allies, officials, mayors, regional councilmen, all tied to him by secrets, debts, or fear. He didn't control Parliament, but he steered it, like a hand on the rudder of a ship no one knew was sinking. When investigations began, they rarely reached him. Paper trails vanished. Witnesses changed their minds. Testimonies were retracted or simply lost. He had built a fortress out of bureaucracy and intimidation. Not one wall, but dozens, each more difficult to penetrate than the last. Some said he had lunch with a deputy minister once. Others believed he blackmailed a cabinet member with a single photograph. No one knew if these stories were true, but that was the beauty of it. Matteo thrived in the space between rumor and reality. That's where power lives. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was shaping policies, directing contracts, influencing which towns received development grants and which ones didn't. Roads were paved not because they were needed, but because they lined someone's pockets, his pockets, and in return, silence. When blood stains a parliament floor, it doesn't scream. It seeps, slowly, quietly, until it's part of the wood. That's what Matteo understood. That real control is not about holding office, it's about holding leverage. And in that game, he played everyone. By the time his name appeared in official inquiries, it was already too late. The laws had been signed, the deals had been made, the cameras were off, and once again, Matteo was already gone. Not in hiding, not afraid, just smiling somewhere else, knowing the system still bent in his direction. In Sicily, there was the Italy you read about in textbooks, and then there was the Italy Matteo Messina Denaro helped build, brick by invisible brick. It wasn't marked on any map, and it didn't have a flag, but it had rules, it had order, and it had power. His power, a state within the state. He didn't just use violence, he used leverage. Bribes were not crude envelopes stuffed with bills, they were favors granted at the perfect time. A struggling official's son given a job. A business license approved after weeks of delay. A loan mysteriously forgiven. No threats, just outcomes. But behind every favor was a silent chain. And if a bribe didn't work, blackmail usually did. Matteo had ears everywhere, in hotels, in churches, in political offices and private bedrooms. Information flowed to him like rain into a reservoir. He didn't need to threaten. He just needed to remind you that he remembered something you prayed no one else did. He had files, they said. Actual files. Records of meetings, photographs, audio. Not for every politician, but enough. Enough to bend laws, enough to delay investigations. Enough to make entire parliamentary sessions end early without anyone daring to ask why. And the ballots? Those were his favorite tools, because democracy, in the hands of someone like Matteo, was just another weapon. He didn't need to run for office. He just needed to decide who did. In local elections, whole towns would swing one way, not because of policy, but because the right number of whispers had been passed through the cafes and barbershops. People voted for safety. And in Matteo's Sicily, safety meant obedience. Sometimes he even helped rivals win if it suited his interests. Control wasn't about loyalty, it was about utility. As long as the winner remembered who got them there, Matteo was satisfied. And if they forgot? Well, no one forgot twice. The true brilliance of it all was how quietly it worked. No bombs, no car chases, just signatures, just silence. A mayor who suddenly changed his mind, a prosecutor who decided to retire early, a journalist who chose a different story to chase. It was said that you could walk into a government building in Palermo and not know who truly ran it. But if you listened closely, in the pauses between conversations, in the sudden hush when a certain name was mentioned, you'd hear it, that hum beneath the surface, the rhythm of a shadow government. And at the center of it all, never seen but always felt, sat Matteo. Not a prime minister, not a president, something older, something colder. The architect of an Italy that existed in the cracks, an empire made not of borders, but of fear. It never needed a contract. No signatures, no witnesses, just a nod, a glance, a silence shared across a dinner table where the wine was too expensive and the laughter too rehearsed. This was the pact of power, the ancient, invisible handshake between Matteo Messina Denaro's world and the one that claimed to govern it. Politicians made promises they couldn't keep. Matteo made promises he couldn't break. That was the difference. And somewhere along the way, those who wore robes or suits began to understand something dangerous. They needed him more than he needed them. In Sicily, it wasn't always the loudest man in parliament who called the shots. Sometimes, it was the one who didn't speak at all but whose presence lingered after the meetings ended. That was Matteo's gift. He didn't need to be in the room. His influence arrived before him and stayed long after he was gone. There were prosecutors who paused investigations mid-sentence, councilmen who suddenly shifted their votes, business permits that passed without review. These weren't coincidences. They were the terms of a pact, one not written in law, but in blood and benefit. The deal was simple: protection for obedience. Matteo kept things stable. No bombings, no shootings, no headlines that scared away tourists or investors. In return, the officials kept their mouths shut and their hands open. A bribe here, a favor there, enough to buy a vacation home, or re-election, or silence. Sometimes the deals came wrapped in charity, a donation to a church, a playground built in a poor neighborhood. Matteo understood the optics. He let the politicians take credit, let them stand in front of microphones and pretend they had cleaned up the streets. All the while, he was just cleaning out the profits. There were dinners in villas hidden behind iron gates, glasses clinking, toasts offered with too many knowing looks, and behind closed doors, names were exchanged. Who needed to be protected? Who needed to be removed? Who needed a reminder? This pact wasn't universal. There were still men of integrity, but they were rare, and they were careful, because everyone knew the cost of standing too tall in Matteo's shadow. A career could disappear, a body could vanish, and the pact would remain untouched. It was never about ideology, left or right, north or south. It didn't matter. Power is always drawn to its own reflection. And in Matteo, the system saw something it couldn't resist: order without oversight, results without delay, and consequences without mercy. That's why the pact held for so long, not because it was feared, but because, in some quiet, dangerous way, it worked. Matteo Messina Denaro didn't just disappear, he erased the very idea of where he'd ever been. For over 3 decades, he lived like smoke, impossible to grip, always slipping through cracks, yet always present. His genius wasn't just in brutality or bribery, it was in vanishing, in becoming the question no one could answer, the shadow no spotlight could hold. He built his safety like a painter builds a canvas layer by careful layer. Fake names, fake IDs, properties owned through shell companies, friends who weren't friends, just placeholders, lovers who never knew his real name. 100 stories told by 100 different people, none of them entirely true, all of them close enough to confuse. He never stayed anywhere long. Safe houses rotated like clockwork, apartments in coastal towns, remote farms, small villas nestled in quiet hills. The doors were always locked from the inside, the curtains always drawn. He cooked his own food, burned his own trash, and used old phones that could be thrown away without notice. And if a room felt too quiet, he left it. Instinct didn't need proof. Instinct was enough. He didn't use the internet. He didn't trust cars with GPS. He knew where every camera was and how to walk, so his face stayed turned. In cities, he wore glasses, hats, new clothes. In the countryside, he walked like he belonged because he always did. Denaro wasn't hiding in caves. He was hiding in plain sight, but he didn't do it alone. His world was built on loyalty that went beyond money. There were doctors who treated him without asking questions, farmers who gave him a place to sleep, families who had known his father and now owed their silence to the son. If one house fell, 10 more stood ready. If one person cracked, 2 others closed the gap. His network was woven from fear and favor, stretched across the island like a net beneath a tightrope. The police would search, arrest his couriers, raid old homes, and every time they came close but not close enough. Because Matteo didn't think like a fugitive, he thought like a strategist. Every safe house was disposable, every friend a moving piece, and every disappearance planned. Over the years, he became a myth. Reporters called him Italy's last godfather, but no one had seen him in over a decade. His name remained on wanted posters. His face was aged by forensic artists. But to the people who still served him, he was neither lost nor hunted. He was simply elsewhere. The art of not being caught wasn't just survival. It was power, because the more he slipped away, the more untouchable he became. And in a country built on headlines and handshakes, Matteo Messina Denaro ruled by doing something no one else could. He vanished and stayed in control. From the outside, it looked like prosperity. A growing real estate firm in Palermo, a chain of cafes in Trapani, a logistics company that moved olives, oranges, and whatever else the Mediterranean sun could grow. But behind the contracts and clean offices, Matteo Messina Denaro was still pulling strings. Only now, he wore gloves made of silk. This was the mask of legitimacy. It didn't just hide him, it sanctified him. It gave him the power to walk through courts and councils as a phantom investor, his name never listed, his presence always implied. Money flowed, not in briefcases, but in bank transfers, not in back rooms, but in boardrooms, and every euro had been scrubbed so clean it sparkled. He learned early that violence might build fear, but paperwork builds empires. So he built companies through frontmen, school friends, distant cousins, men who owed him favors so old they could no longer be counted. They signed the forms, paid the taxes, smiled for the photos. Meanwhile, Matteo watched from the shadows. Every profit report another proof of his reach. The businesses served 2 purposes. First, they laundered. Dirty money went in, clean money came out, wrapped in receipts and approved by auditors who never thought to look twice. Second, they provided silence. If a mayor's cousin had a stake in a construction firm, he was far less likely to ask questions about how that firm won every tender in town. Even priests were sometimes involved. Churches were renovated. Orphanages received anonymous donations. And behind the altar, no one dared mention that the new marble floors might have been paid for by blood. That was the beauty of it. Respectability bought immunity. The public loves a philanthropist, even when they smell of smoke and iron. He invested in agriculture, shipping, tourism. Every one of these ventures created jobs, fed families, put roofs over heads. That was no accident. It created a kind of quiet loyalty. The people might not have liked who he was, but they liked what he gave them. And in Sicily, gratitude has a long memory. Sometimes, officials would dig too deep, follow the paper trail, catch a whiff of something wrong. But by then, it was already too late. The company had changed names, the assets had moved, the man they were looking for had vanished again. That was the brilliance of the mask. Matteo didn't pretend to be someone else. He pretended to be no one at all. Just another investor, another name on the lease, another whisper in a town where everyone already knew who was really in charge. Because in the end, legitimacy wasn't about truth. It was about the illusion of truth. And Matteo wore that illusion like a tailor-made suit, clean, polished, bulletproof. In the summer heat of Palermo, the air once cracked with more than just the sound of cicadas. It carried fire, stone, screams. The city shook not from an earthquake, but from the force of intention. The bombings weren't random, they were messages. and Matteo Messina Denaro understood every syllable. The year was not just marked in calendars, it was burned into walls and memory. Judges fell. Anti-mafia prosecutors who had stared too long into the dark were swallowed by it. One explosion on a highway outside Palermo, another beneath the cobbled streets. Men like Falcone and Borsellino, men who believed the law could still win, were turned into martyrs by men who believed in something colder. But Matteo didn't just want blood, he wanted leverage. Chaos was a ladder, and every civilian casualty, every shattered window, every funeral that clogged the streets, pushed him closer to the top. The state flinched, the public wept, and in that moment of weakness, the mafia moved. He didn't plant every bomb, he didn't press every trigger, but the fingerprints of his mind were there, dusted across every headline. He understood that power wasn't just about killing. It was about when you killed, where, how, and who was watching when it happened. The bombings fractured more than glass, they fractured trust. People no longer believed they were safe, that the police could protect them, that justice would hold. And into that vacuum, Matteo poured quiet deals, whispered alliances, and the iron calm of someone who had already planned the next 10 steps. He used the chaos to negotiate, to bargain with the very government he had just humiliated. Offers were made in back channels, back off, and the bombs stop, push too hard, and the next blast might echo from Rome. The strategy worked. Investigations slowed. Some prosecutors were reassigned, some cases dissolved like salt in water, and the streets, once soaked with blood, fell silent, not because peace had won, but because power had. For the people, the message was clear. The mafia did not fear the state. The state feared the mafia. And Matteo Messina Denaro was the architect of that fear. Years later, when asked about those days, he never answered. But silence, in his world, was louder than any confession, because he knew what he had built not just with dynamite, but with timing, precision, and cold calculation. In Palermo, the buildings were rebuilt, the roads repaired. But something deeper remained broken. Trust, hope, the belief that the good could win. And for Matteo, that was the real victory. Because fear doesn't need to speak, it just needs to wait. And he had all the time in the world. They stood like lighthouses in a storm, Giovanni, Falcone, and Paolo Borsellino, judges who dared to look the Sicilian darkness in the eye and not blink. They weren't just prosecutors, they were symbols, living proof that the mafia could bleed, could be named, could be challenged. And for that, Matteo Messina Denaro marked them. Falcone understood the machine. He didn't chase shadows, he followed money. Built cases with patience and precision. He believed that even Cosa Nostra had a heartbeat, and if you listened close enough, you could track it. Borsellino was fire, outspoken, fearless. He had grown up with the mafia outside his window and decided early on that he would never kneel. They were friends, the kind forged in war. One knew the cost, the other accepted it, and together, they became the most dangerous threat the mafia had faced in generations. Not because they had power, but because they had purpose. That made them radioactive, untouchable in courtrooms, but not on the streets. Matteo didn't pull the trigger. He didn't wire the explosives. But the decision, the green light, was part of his world. And in that world, fear was currency. When the mafia felt cornered, it lashed out. Not with desperation, but with message. Kill the law, and you remind everyone who's really in control. In 1992, a bomb tore through the highway outside Palermo. Falcone's car was lifted into the air as if by an invisible hand, shattered, silenced. Borsellino followed weeks later, blown apart near his mother's home. Two men who had once walked side by side, now buried under the same sun they once tried to clean. The city mourned, the country erupted, and Matteo watched. Because this wasn't just murder, it was a turning point. The state had been dared to act, and it did. Raids, arrests, trials. Politicians who once whispered now shouted. But behind the fury, something quieter happened. People became afraid again. Witnesses stepped back. Testimonies changed. The streets learned to stay silent. Matteo knew that killing men like Falcone and Borsellino wouldn't destroy the justice system, but it would shake its foundation. And in that tremble, he found space, room to rebuild, regroup, reassert. He never bragged, never gave interviews, but those who followed him understood the lesson. Power is not only about who you kill, but who you choose to kill in front of everyone. And when their pictures were printed, when candles were lit, Matteo's name was never far behind, spoken in hushed tones, never confirmed, always suspected, because in Sicily, some ghosts walk taller after death, and some men, like Denaro, learn to rule from the shadows they leave behind. In Matteo Messina Denaro's world, death wasn't just punishment, it was punctuation, a final word at the end of a whispered threat, a signature on a broken promise. He didn't always kill to eliminate sometimes, he killed to speak. And when he did, the message echoed louder than the gunshot. Not every body found in the street was the result of personal rage. In fact, most weren't. Denaro believed in silence, but when silence failed, he turned to violence, not recklessly, not wildly, but with precision. One man might vanish for stealing money. Another might die for talking too much. A third for simply forgetting where loyalty ends and ambition begins. The reasons varied, but the intent never did. Each killing served a function. An accountant discovered floating in a canal was not just a tragedy, it was a warning to others cooking books the wrong way. A local politician whose car exploded was not just an accident, it was a reminder that certain decisions had consequences. And when a traitor disappeared without a trace, the void he left behind did more damage than a bullet ever could. Denaro's strategy was elegant in its cruelty. By the time someone realized they were in danger, it was already too late. No trial, no second chance. Just a gap where a man used to be, and the chilling realization that no one could fill it without knowing they might be next. He understood that fear moves faster than truth, that rumors do more work than evidence, so he let the stories swirl. Did he really have a man killed for showing up late to a meeting? Was it true he had a lover executed for leaking a name? No one knew, and that uncertainty was the point. When people believe you're capable of anything, you don't have to do everything. The true brilliance wasn't in how often he ordered death, it was in how little he needed to. One body every few years, strategically placed, could do what 100 couldn't: create silence, discipline, obedience, and more than that, reverence. Sometimes, the killings stopped altogether, but the memory of them didn't. That's how diplomacy worked in Denaro's world. You don't send letters. You don't negotiate terms. You send a funeral and let the rest of the room adjust their behavior accordingly. By turning murder into language, Denaro crafted an empire not built on territory, but on perception. He didn't need a crown. He didn't need a throne. He only needed people to ask themselves, before every move, what if he's watching? And that question, quiet, unseen, was the sharpest blade he ever used. In Sicily, fire speaks. It speaks in the blackened shell of a car, the scorched frame of a storefront, the thick smoke curling through a family's kitchen before sunrise. And no one spoke that language more fluently than Matteo Messina Denaro. He knew bullets made headlines, but flames made statements. Arson was clean in its message, chaotic in its aftermath, and always deniable. A rival's vineyard reduced to ash? Insurance claim. A politician's vacation home mysteriously gutted. Faulty wiring. A journalist's office engulfed in smoke on the same day their story hit the press. Just coincidence, unless you understood the dialect of fear. Matteo didn't need to leave notes. The flames were the notes. The heat was the warning. And every fire was set, not just to destroy, but to announce. Someone had crossed a line. Someone had forgotten who owned the streets, The walls, the silence, and fire remembers everything. It wasn't always about revenge. Sometimes it was about control. A store owner, refusing to pay protection, would find their shutters melted by morning. A construction firm bidding against one of Matteo's companies might watch their equipment light up like a bonfire. No one needed to die. That was the elegance of it. The fear was enough. Explosions were rarer, but when they came, they were theatrical. Denaro understood spectacle. He understood that a car bomb didn't just kill a target, it told the whole city that the rules had changed, that no one was untouchable, that even in broad daylight, even under the watch of the law, the mafia still decided who walked home and who didn't. And then came the campaigns. Not a single fire, but a season of them. One after another. A judge's mailbox burned out front. A police captain's garage ignited. The neighborhood trembled. The newspapers whispered. And Matteo watched as the balance shifted, not because he issued demands, but because the smoke made them for him. Even the timing mattered. Near holidays, on anniversaries of past killings, the symbolism was layered, deliberate, a reminder that the past was not past, that the mafia never forgets, and Denaro, especially, never forgives. He didn't always order it directly. Sometimes it was a nod, a phone call with no words, a look across a dinner table. The flames would follow. That was the efficiency of power. Built on fear, you don't have to give orders when your silence already sounds like one. To outsiders, it looked like madness. But to those who lived in it, who breathed that ash-stained air, it was fluency. The language of fire, spoken without voice, heard without ears. And at the center of every burning silence, Matteo Messina Denaro was listening. They say he once whispered it like a joke, like a man recounting a fishing story after too much wine. I filled a cemetery myself, just 5 words, quiet, almost casual. But in Matteo Messina Denaro's world, words like that weren't bravado, they were truth wearing a grin. No one knows exactly when he said it. Some say it was over dinner in a safe house. Others claim it came in a rare moment of honesty during a taped conversation. But the line stuck, because it sounded too real to be fiction, and because everyone who heard it knew he probably wasn't exaggerating. By the time he was in his 30s, Matteo was already considered one of the most ruthless minds in Cosa Nostra, not just for how many had died under his rise, but for how precisely he chose who would. He was not a madman, he was not sloppy, he was cold, efficient, selective, but also prolific. A cemetery in Sicilian villages isn't just a place for the dead, it's a map of memory. Generations lie side by side. You walk past uncles, school teachers, childhood friends. In some towns, the names repeat because the bloodlines are so tight. When Matteo made that claim, he wasn't talking about strangers. He was talking about a personal ledger names he had crossed out himself. Some were rivals, some were snitches, some were mistakes, but all were gone because he decided they should be. And to hear him say it, not with pride, not with regret, but with flat certainty, revealed something deeper than cruelty. It revealed calculation. The kind that doesn't flinch. The kind that can smile while someone begs. The kind that knows cemeteries aren't sad places, they're quiet ones. And Matteo loved quiet. The irony, of course, is that for years, he became a ghost himself. A man so good at making others vanish that he turned invisible too. But those words, those 5 words, were the opposite of vanishing. They lingered. They settled in the ears of those who had once worked beside him or beneath him, and they haunted the men who hunted him. Because even in hiding, even as years passed and photographs aged and voices changed, the legend remained sharp. The kind of legend that grows in darkness, that sits heavy on your chest in the night. The kind that makes you walk faster past the cemetery wall, just in case. Matteo didn't need to carve his name into history. He'd already carved it into marble, dozens of times. Stone by stone, plot by plot, grave by grave, and somewhere out there, the cemetery he spoke of is still filling slowly, silently, with the weight of what one man once decided was necessary. It happened quietly, as it always does with men like him. One moment, Matteo Messina Denaro was still visible, still a name on a list, still a shadow behind a door, still breathing the same air as the men hunting him. And then came 1993, and just like that, he vanished. It wasn't dramatic. No shootout, no last-minute dash across a border, no grainy footage of him boarding a plane. He simply stepped into the fog of silence and never stepped out. That year, the state tightened its grip. Arrests were rising, allies were falling, and the old rules, the ones that had protected men like Matteo, were changing. He understood the shift before most. He could smell the storm coming. The mafia was bleeding. The judges were no longer afraid to sign warrants. The newspapers were naming names. His name. So he did what predators do when the light gets too bright. He disappeared into the dark. Castelvetrano lost its son. Sicily lost its most dangerous strategist. But Matteo didn't run in panic. He didn't scatter. He moved with intent, like a man who had prepared for this moment his entire life. Safe houses were already waiting, contacts already in place, documents forged, routes memorized. The web spun long before the spider fled, and so began one of the longest vanishing acts in European history. No photos, no phone calls, no fingerprints. For the first few months, investigators believed they were close. They tapped relatives. They watched bank accounts. They even followed rumors of plastic surgery, of disguises, of women who might have known where he slept. But Matteo stayed gone, and as the years rolled on, his legend grew even as his face began to fade. He became a ghost wrapped in newspaper ink, a name whispered in courtrooms, a presence that stalked the spaces between facts. The irony was cruel. The man most responsible for orchestrating death on a public stage now lived entirely in the shadows, and yet his influence never waned. Murders were still committed in his name. Businesses still paid him homage. His signature, though unseen, still appeared in the aftermath of violence. That was the art of it. The vanishing wasn't a retreat. It was a strategy, a long game. While others were caught in handcuffs and headlines, Matteo became myth, untouchable, unseen, but always there. And in 1993, when he walked off the grid and into the fog, a new kind of power was born, not one built on presence, but on absence, and every day that passed without his capture only made that power stronger, because a man who disappears completely becomes the kind of story that never truly leaves. It wasn't luck. It was loyalty, woven thick as blood and deep as roots. For 30 years, Matteo Messina Denaro remained invisible, not because the world is big, but because his world was built to hide him. And in that world, silence was sacred. Loyalty was law. To the outside eye, it looked impossible. How could a man so infamous, so wanted, evade one of the most powerful law enforcement machines in Europe for 3 full decades? But Matteo wasn't alone. He was never alone. He was protected by a network older than some governments, more organized than some armies, and far more committed than any task force chasing him. This was not a single web, but hundreds threads of family, business, and blood, knotted together across Sicily, stretching through villages, towns, cities, and even across borders. At the center sat Matteo, not as a king on a throne, but as a ghost in a whisper. He didn't have to give orders. He had become the order. Safe houses were passed between trusted hands like heirlooms. A cousin here, a childhood friend there, a loyal driver, a quiet doctor, grocers who never asked questions, lawyers who spoke in code, priests who heard too much and said too little. Every favor repaid, every risk balanced. A chain of silence that reached into every corner of the island. Money moved without names. Shell companies wrapped in more shell companies. properties registered to widows, to foreigners, to men who died 10 years before. He lived in plain sight, behind borrowed faces and forged documents. At times, he may have been living just miles from where the search parties gathered, but they never saw him, because no one with a mouth to speak would let a word slip, and for those tempted to betray, there was no need for threats. The legend was enough. They knew what he was capable of. What silence had preserved, a single breath could destroy. So they stayed loyal, not out of fear alone, but out of a shared understanding. If Matteo fell, so would everything else. He wasn't just protected by the network. He was part of the network's foundation. Time passed, governments changed, officers retired. But the net that held him never broke. Not even once. For 30 years, 1,000 small loyalties became a fortress without walls, built in the minds of men, in the glances passed over dinner tables, in the numbers scribbled on scraps and burned before morning. No alarms, no passwords, just trust, and the unshakable belief that protecting him meant protecting the order of things. He was their prince, and in silence, they kept him crowned. The mirror doesn't lie, but it can be made to forget. Matteo Messina Denaro, the man who vanished in 1993, would not remain the same man by 1994. To live in the shadows for decades, he needed more than loyalty. He needed to become someone else, again and again. The stories are fragments, none confirmed, all believable. Some say the first surgery happened in a farmhouse near Trapani. Others claim it was done abroad, in a clinic that asked no questions and kept no records. What mattered wasn't how many stitches it took, or where the scalpel first touched skin. What mattered was the result, a face that no longer sparked recognition, a man who could walk past a wanted poster and see a stranger staring back. He didn't chase glamour. The changes were subtle. A shift in the shape of the jaw, a scar added or removed, hair thinned or darkened. The kind of edits a childhood friend might not notice in passing, but a police officer would miss entirely. Matteo knew that becoming invisible wasn't about vanishing into mist, it was about blending into crowds. Names, too, were traded like currency. He used dozens. Sometimes he was a retiree, sometimes a businessman, occasionally a patient with a quiet illness, always someone unremarkable. Always someone just distant enough from his real self to keep the trail cold. But the reinvention ran deeper than the surface. It was in his voice, his habits, even his posture. Those who specialize in disappearance understand. You don't just hide your body. You erase your presence. You change the way you walk into a room. You learn to speak less, listen more. You master stillness. Matteo did not need to play roles. He became them. Each new identity was a costume stitched in silence. He had no social media, no traceable phone, no bank account with his true name. And yet he traveled. He dined. He was seen by those who didn't know who they were looking at. Doctors operated on him under fake credentials. Pharmacies filled prescriptions for ghost names. Clinics treated a man whose birth certificate belonged to someone long dead or never born. Every record bent to the will of his network. Every file that could betray him was rewritten. And so, year by year, the man who once filled cemeteries became a phantom of flesh and clever paperwork, still breathing, still commanding, still smiling perhaps, as he passed the newsstands carrying his old photo. The world searched for a face that no longer existed, because Matteo understood something simple and chilling. If you change enough, if you vanish thoroughly enough, the world begins to forget what you ever looked like at all. There were whispers that he bought his morning coffee from the same barista every day, that he strolled past policemen with newspapers tucked under his arm, that he sat in waiting rooms beside elderly couples, filling out forms with a name that was never his. Matteo Messina Denaro, the most hunted man in Italy, was not in some mountain cave or foreign exile. He was hiding in the open. That was the brilliance of it. Disappearance, real disappearance, is not about darkness, it's about light. about being so ordinary, so utterly forgettable, that the world never pauses long enough to take a second look. Matteo knew this, and he mastered it. The doctors who treated him didn't know. The neighbors who nodded at him in stairwells had no idea. He had become the man who held the door open, who waited his turn, who paid in cash and smiled politely. The ghost had manners, and so the world welcomed him, never realizing they were offering kindness to a killer. His apartment was modest, a rented space in a building like any other. He lived alone, no lavish displays, no armed guards, just a quiet routine in a city that had forgotten how loud his name used to be. He shopped in local stores. He wore clothes that didn't draw attention. He answered to names that passed through ears like dust, forgettable, functional, safe. Even as his old life haunted the headlines, he drifted through streets where no one knew they were looking into the eyes of a myth. Decades had passed. His face had changed. His energy had softened. The fire in him, they said, was still there, but buried deep, where only those who truly knew him could feel its warmth or its threat. What made it all more surreal was the silence. The world around him spoke of justice, of manhunts, of capture, and yet no one truly saw him, because no one expected to find the devil wearing reading glasses and a quiet smile. For 30 years, Matteo's greatest weapon was not violence, it was invisibility. He didn't need tunnels or armed caravans. He needed only routine, predictability, 1,000 careful steps taken one at a time, always just below suspicion. He was the ghost who waited in line at the pharmacy, the man who walked his dog when the streets were empty, the figure in the corner of a CCTV frame, unrecognized and unremarkable. And when the world finally caught up, it wasn't because he made a mistake. It was because the veil of time had finally worn thin. But for all those years before the ghost had walked among us, and we never knew. There are rules when you vanish, not the kind you read in books, but the kind carved into your bones by necessity. Matteo Messina Denaro followed them with the precision of a surgeon and the devotion of a priest. For 30 years, these rules were his shield, his prison, and his gospel. Never call, never linger, never trust. He never used phones. Not really. Not ones in his name, not ones tied to real addresses. If a call had to be made, it was made from a burner used once, then destroyed. Conversations were brief, rehearsed, wrapped in layers of coded language. Sometimes a nod was worth more than words. Sometimes silence said everything. He never lingered. In cafes, in apartments, in people's lives. He moved through the world like a shadow, present but passing. He knew that even comfort was a threat. Stay in one place too long, and faces start to notice you. Patterns form, suspicion follows. So he stayed restless, even in stillness. Even his routines were broken deliberately. Coffee at different hours, different streets walked on different days. Every moment shaped to leave no footprint, and he never trusted. Not fully. Trust was the currency that cost the most and paid the least. Loyalty, yes, he believed in that. But trust the kind that blinds you, that softens you, that was poison. He had seen too many men buried because they trusted the wrong voice, the wrong smile, the wrong woman. He wouldn't be one of them, so he kept his circle tight. Family, yes, a few sworn allies, but even then, everyone was kept on a need-to-know basis, a whisper here, a signal there. No one person ever held the whole picture. That way, if someone broke, the damage would be small, contained. Even pleasure had rules. No photos, no internet, no careless luxury that might draw a curious glance. Everything about him had to be forgettable. From the shoes he wore to the papers he carried. He wasn't just hiding from the law, he was hiding from memory itself. To outsiders, it may have seemed like freedom, living without taxes, without laws, without surveillance. But the truth was colder. Matteo had traded his name for a silence that never slept. He lived in a world where eye contact was risk, where trust was weakness, and where even a smile had to be calculated. And yet, for decades, it worked, because the rules, though brutal, were flawless. He followed them, he lived by them, and for a very long time they kept the ghost alive. In Campobello di Mazzara, no one looked twice at Andrea Bonafede. He was quiet, well-mannered, a man who paid in cash and minded his business. The kind of neighbor who kept his gate locked, his curtains drawn, and his conversations brief. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that Andrea Bonafede was not Andrea Bonafede. He was Matteo Messina Denaro, the ghost who had haunted Sicily for over 3 decades. The name he used belonged to a real man, a cousin, someone whose documents could be borrowed, bent, reshaped. With that identity, Matteo rented a modest apartment, underwent surgery, and received cancer treatments in Palermo hospitals. He carried health cards, prescriptions, even a loyalty card for groceries, all in the name of Bonafede. The system never blinked, no alarms went off. The ghost had become flesh, and the state had welcomed him back without knowing. In exile, Matteo didn't live like a king. His apartment was small, sparse, practical. But it was enough. He didn't need opulence, he needed invisibility. A bed to sleep in, a table to eat at, a place to disappear between the bricks and dust of a forgotten Sicilian town. He moved among retirees, shopkeepers, and children playing in courtyards, all of whom had no idea that the most wanted man in Italy was within arm's reach. He dressed in everyday clothes, drove a used car, wore glasses, walked like a man with nothing to hide and everything to protect. There was no luxury villa, no armed guards patrolling hallways. Just one man, alone, carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets on shoulders that had learned to shrug like everyone else's. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved. He helped carry groceries once or twice, said buongiorno with the right amount of distance. He gave them just enough to blend in, but never too much to invite a second glance. That was the art he had perfected, being someone and no one at once. But beneath the routine, the stillness, the masks, the truth was never far. A man who had once orchestrated bombings, decided who lived and died, and filled cemeteries with whispers, now stood in pharmacy lines with pensioners. He had gone from kingmaker to ghost, from legend to shadow, and yet, in Campobello, Matteo Messina Denaro lived his final act, not with gunfire, but with quiet footsteps and borrowed names, a new man, in a town that never knew, until it did. Every morning began the same, a quiet walk through the streets of Campobello di Mazzara, where the sun spilled over tiled rooftops and stray cats stretched in doorways. Matteo Messina Denaro, though no one called him, that slipped into the rhythm of ordinary life with the grace of a man who had studied invisibility for decades. He was not the boss, not the ghost, not the legend. He was just a man named Andrea, a man who liked his espresso hot, his newspapers folded neatly, and his routines unbroken. He visited the same cafe most mornings, sat at the same table. The barista came to know his order without asking. A small espresso, a glass of water, no sugar. He never lingered long, just enough to nod politely, scan the headlines, and disappear again. In those moments, he was indistinguishable from the old men who shuffled in with canes and stories from another era. That was the point. The newspapers he read carried echoes of the world that once revolved around him. Names he knew, wars he had outlived, judges and politicians who had chased his shadow but never caught it. Sometimes he smiled at the irony how his picture still ran on front pages, while his true self sat unnoticed in the corner, sipping bitter coffee and watching the clock. Then came the hospital visits, routine now. Matteo had cancer. His body, once feared and obeyed, had turned on him. Chemotherapy sessions became part of his weekly schedule. The waiting rooms, the nurses, the quiet pain. Even here, he kept to himself. He registered under the false name, sat patiently, endured silently. There were no complaints, no dramatics. He had survived bullets, betrayals, Manhunts, this was just another enemy to outlast. Neighbors remembered him as solitary but polite. He paid in cash, tipped well, walked with purpose but never in a rush. He cleaned up after himself, never raised his voice, never got too close. Just a man who lived quietly, who drove a modest car, and whose curtains stayed closed even on the brightest days. But beneath that silence lived decades of noise, decisions that changed nations, orders that ended lives, secrets that, even now, remained buried. Matteo had built an empire on fear and fire, but in exile, his kingdom shrank to the size of a daily paper, a plastic hospital chair, and a steaming cup of espresso. And yet, that was how he survived. For nearly 30 years, he became the man no one noticed, a quiet figure among many, a ghost pretending to breathe. And in that stillness, he remained free until the very end began. No cake, no candles, no chorus of voices singing his name. For Matteo Messina Denaro, birthdays passed like smoke noticed by no one, marked only by memory. Yet even ghosts keep track of time. Even shadows grow older. Somewhere, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, each year, he added another number to the silence. He never missed a birthday. Not really. He just changed how they were kept. Sometimes it was a quiet dinner alone with a bottle of red wine and music playing low from an old radio. Sometimes it was a short trip to the sea, where the salt in the air reminded him of a childhood too far gone to grasp. But always, he knew the day. Always, he counted. In the early years of hiding, it may have been a brief gathering, 3 or 4 trusted men, speaking in whispers, toasting the name they never said aloud. But as the net grew tighter and the years dragged on, even those moments faded. Risk grew heavier than ritual. And so Matteo adapted. He found meaning in small things, a favorite dish, a walk under the stars, a flickering candle lit not for celebration, but for remembrance. Sometimes he'd visit the graveyard at night, not to mourn, to reflect. Many who had once stood beside him now lay beneath the earth. Friends, rivals, soldiers, traitors. Some had fallen by his command, others had simply been outlived. On those nights, Matteo didn't need a party. He had memories and ghosts, enough to fill a room. He received no gifts. But the world still moved for him. A safe apartment, an untouched alias, protection that money and silence could buy. In those moments, survival itself became the present. Living another year, remaining one step ahead, being forgotten by everyone except those who mattered most. And yet, despite the secrecy, despite the solitude, Matteo remembered every date, every year. Not just his own birthday, but the birthdays of others long gone. His father, his sister, his enemies. They lived in the same calendar of the heart, marked by absence, tracked by a mind that never forgot, and a soul that never forgave. So, when the day came each year, no one noticed the man in the cafe who lingered an extra minute. No one saw the flicker of thought behind dark glasses. No one guessed that the man buying fresh pastries in silence was toasting another year alive, another year unseen. Shadows have birthdays too, and they never stop counting. He never needed a throne or a room full of men kissing his hand. Matteo Messina Denaro ruled through absence. His power did not echo in crowded palaces or grand speeches. It pulsed through whispers, coded glances, and unreturned phone calls. He was not there, and yet he was everywhere. From Campobello's dusty streets to the heart of Palermo's underworld, orders were spoken in his name, and they were followed. Businesses thrived or crumbled based on his invisible nod. Lives were spared or extinguished without a single fingerprint. Denaro didn't sit in meetings anymore. He didn't need to. His name alone carried enough weight to silence a room. It wasn't just fear. It was reverence. Among those still loyal to the old ways, he was the last of a dying breed. the final student of Rena's blood-soaked school, the last man who knew what it meant to disappear, not just from sight but from memory, and still pull the strings. His face had changed, his voice lowered, his steps softened, but his influence had not faded. If anything, exile had sharpened it. Messages passed through a dozen hands before reaching their final targets. Paper scraps burned after reading, keys handed off with no words exchanged, money moved in suitcases, guns arrived in fishing boats. A nod from a cousin, a raised eyebrow at a funeral. Matteo's empire didn't need him present. It only needed his legend alive. He controlled the tempo of life in entire towns without showing his face. Markets bent to his will. Courtroom testimonies crumbled under quiet threats. Even elections, some whispered, had his hand behind them, soft and unseen. He had turned invisibility into strategy. Denaro's magic was that he had become both myth and mechanism, a name you didn't say out loud, a shadow behind every door. And if someone broke the rules, if someone spoke too freely, stepped too far, they didn't receive a warning. They received a silence so deep it screamed. Then the consequences followed, and no one asked why. They already knew. In a world that prized visibility, Matteo mastered the opposite. He built power through absence. He proved that presence was not required to dominate, that a true godfather does not need to be seen to be obeyed. Even in hiding, even while walking among strangers in supermarkets, he commanded a world with no border but loyalty, no currency but fear, no language but whispers. Ghost and godfather, one man, one shadow, still calling the shots. There are men who fear prison, others who fear death. But Matteo Messina Denaro feared something quieter: being seen. In a world addicted to cameras, obsessed with images, he made a vow that would define his exile. No photographs, no selfies, no security footage, no curious snapshots from passing tourists. For decades, no one could say what he looked like. The last confirmed image was from the 1990s, a young man with sunglasses and a sly grin. After that, nothing. He became a ghost in the age of surveillance. As the world digitized, Matteo erased. He vanished from databases, ducked facial recognition, dodged satellites, and refused even the smallest vanity. He understood the game better than anyone. A photograph is not just a memory, it is a weapon. One picture in the wrong hands could bring helicopters, raids, and headlines. So he removed the risk entirely. Friends were warned, lovers silenced, family trained in the art of omission. If he attended a wedding, he arrived after the cameras left. If he went to a funeral, it was in the shadows, behind tinted windows. He was the empty chair at the dinner, the man always just out of frame. Even law enforcement began to doubt. Artists drew composite sketches. Forensic teams tried to age his face with software. But every year that passed without a new image gave him more power. It was not just that they couldn't find him. It was that they no longer knew what they were looking for. Was he heavier now? Balding? Sick? Replaced by a double? The mystery fed his myth. There were rumors of plastic surgery, of crooked doctors bribed to alter cheekbones and jawlines. Some said he had scars that no photo could hide. Others whispered he had a dozen new faces, one for each escape plan. But all anyone could prove was absence. And in that absence, he grew larger than life. To see him was to endanger him. So he lived unrecorded. No documents, no phone with a camera, no credit card that could be traced. He paid in cash, traveled in silence, and looked away when lenses turned. In an age where even nobodies leave trails of digital breadcrumbs, Denaro left none. His invisibility was not luck, it was doctrine, a discipline honed over decades. While the world filmed itself into oblivion, he lived like a man from another era, unseen, undocumented, untouched. He knew one truth better than anyone: you cannot capture a ghost on film. And so, for 30 years, no camera did. While the man vanished, the business did not. Cosa Nostra, under his breath and shadow, became less a brotherhood and more a corporation. Gone were the romanticized oaths in candlelit rooms. In their place, spreadsheets cloaked in code, messages slipped through encrypted apps, and a chain of command that ran like clockwork. Matteo Messina Denaro did not retire. He delegated. Even in hiding, he ruled. From some apartment above a butcher shop or a quiet villa behind hedges, his voice never recorded still carried weight. Orders were passed through loyal lieutenants, sometimes by word of mouth, sometimes scribbled and burned. His empire spanned drug corridors, protection rackets, construction bids, and blackmail schemes, yet there were no fingerprints, no signatures, just outcomes. A business running so smoothly, many forgot the ghost at the top. Extortion was the lifeblood. Businesses paid not just out of fear, but out of tradition. It was a tax older than the government. Denaro's agents collected with subtlety, no kneecaps shattered, just polite reminders. A bakery might burn if payment stopped. A permit might vanish, but most paid without being asked. That was his genius. Violence became suggestion. Then came the drugs. Cocaine from South America, heroin from the East. Routes that changed weekly. Mules who never knew the whole picture. Port officials who turned their backs at the right time. Even in exile, Matteo's cuts came on time. The market adapted, but the margins stayed generous, and there was silence. That was the real product. In a world flooded with noise, he dealt in quiet. Journalists went missing, witnesses recanted, trials collapsed. His name, when whispered, still bent rooms. Politicians remembered favors, bankers forgot questions, and the omerta, once fading, was sharpened into something sharper than fear: respect. He treated the mafia like a portfolio, diversified, decentralized, depersonalized. If a capo fell, another stepped in. If a shipment vanished, another followed. There were no empires to burn because the empire was vapor everywhere and nowhere. It wore no crown. It carried no crest. It simply worked. Denaro understood something most did not: that Cosa Nostra could survive without shootouts or ceremonies. It just needed to remain profitable. He was not the loudest don or the bloodiest, but he was the most enduring. His brilliance was not in how many he killed, but how much he controlled, without ever needing to be seen. And so, while newspapers speculated and police chased shadows, the organization grew. Contracts were signed without names, territories divided by glances. The machine kept turning, and somewhere in the quiet, Matteo watched it all with the calm of a man who had already won. The old mafia bled through phone wires and folded notes. But under Matteo Messina Denaro, it became something else entirely, an organism that breathed through fiber optics and vanished into the cloud. He was no aging relic clutching tradition. He was evolution with a pulse, and he understood that if you want to control the world, you don't need to own the land. You just need to control the signal. By the early 2000s, the mafia was learning new languages: IP addresses, encrypted messaging, burner SIMs, ghost accounts. Matteo wasn't just along for the ride. He was steering. He saw that territory could now be managed from behind a laptop, that meetings could happen without faces, that loyalty could be encrypted, and silence could be programmed. He had lieutenants who understood code better than bullets. Hackers replaced hitmen. Cyber experts scouted targets from thousands of miles away. One message, buried in a meme or slipped into a draft email, could move millions or mark a man for death. Denaro never needed to hold the weapon. He just needed to log in. The old system of messengers and payphones became archaic. So Matteo built digital tunnels, secure enough to withstand the state, clever enough to mimic the banal. WhatsApp chats with no words. Bank transfers routed through countries no one could pronounce. Cryptocurrency wallets hidden behind fake travel blogs. Every trace led somewhere else, until nowhere remained. But even as he embraced the modern, he kept the rules ancient. Betrayal was still punished. Blood still carried meaning. The oath of silence didn't weaken it, just moved platforms. His network used aliases and codes, but the consequences were as real as ever. If someone talked, they vanished. If someone lingered, they burned. He monitored more than money: social media, court filings, surveillance leaks. He watched investigators without them knowing they were being watched. When a magistrate took interest, Denaro already knew their birthday, their habits, their weaknesses. He built digital profiles as carefully as the old dons once sketched turf maps. But his war map was online and far harder to burn. He turned the mafia into something that could not be easily photographed or wiretapped. It existed in fragments, like malware, harmless until activated. It passed through proxies and businesses, foreign servers and leased names. And the man behind it, the one pulling strings through screens, was not a ghost anymore. He was code in motion, a whisper in data. So when people said the mafia was dying, they looked in the wrong place. The streets were quiet, yes, but the wires hummed, the screens blinked. And somewhere, Matteo watched the world scroll by, silent, smiling, immortal in the only place that still matters: the dark, endless net. In a world where trust could cost your life, Matteo Messina Denaro built his legacy not on friendship, but on leverage. To him, loyalty was never sentimental. It was strategic. He didn't ask who was loyal. He asked who had something to lose. That was how you built a throne you could vanish from and still rule. There were men who had stood beside him since the early days. Names known only in whispers: brokers, killers, businessmen in sharp suits with clean records. He gave them just enough power to feel important, never enough to become dangerous. Each one was tethered by a secret, a crime, a buried body, a favor owed. That was the currency Matteo valued most. His true heirs weren't made by blood. They were made by silence. If you spoke too loudly, you disappeared. If you moved too quickly, you lost his shadow. Denaro watched from afar. Sometimes he let a man climb just to see what he'd do with the view. Other times he cut the rope just before it snapped on its own. There were rumors, always rumors, of a favored lieutenant. A man seen leaving a farmhouse late at night. A woman who passed notes through a bakery. Always the same route, never the same time. Matteo had no inner circle. He had a web, and each strand led back to him, even if no one ever saw his face. Some he trusted with shipments, some with messages, some with nothing but their own fear. No one knew everything. That was the genius of it. If the police caught one, they'd only hold a sliver. Enough to threaten, not enough to unravel. His lieutenants might suspect who held more, but they would never ask. That, too, was a rule. You survive longer when you don't need to know. And then there were those he did not trust. The ambitious, the impatient, the ones who thought his long silence meant weakness. He let them speak, he let them plot. And then, quietly, he let them vanish. Not always in blood, sometimes in ruin, sometimes in shame, and sometimes just in the slow erosion of relevance, forgotten, uninvited, locked out of the coded channels that ran the empire. Denaro's throne was not carved in marble or seated in any one place. It was an idea, a presence that persisted because the men beneath it never knew if he was watching, or how close he was, or who around them was still loyal. But the smart ones, the ones who lasted, they all knew the same truth. The ghost still had a crown, and he wore it in silence. Some things were meant to be seen: yachts, villas, bank accounts large enough to touch the sky. Others were meant to stay hidden graves without markers, money without names, secrets that slept in both dirt and digital vaults. Matteo Messina Denaro understood both worlds. He built an empire that glittered above ground and bled beneath it. When investigators chased his fortune, they found ghosts. A vineyard in Tuscany, owned through a chain of companies that looped through Switzerland and vanished in Panama. A villa near Palermo, registered under the name of a dead man whose funeral no one had attended. Frozen assets appeared like apparitions, bank accounts suddenly seized. only for another to surface in a different country with a slightly altered name. The money moved like water through cracks, always one step ahead, always knowing when to disappear. But it wasn't just money that vanished. It was people, rivals, traitors, debtors, men who had once toasted beside him and now were never heard from again, bodies that were never recovered. Not because they were burned, not because they were dumped in rivers, but because they were buried where only Matteo's memory held the map. Some said he never forgot a betrayal. Others said he forgot nothing at all. There were whispers of old wells sealed with concrete, of farmland that concealed more than olives, of contracts carried out not in cities but in silence. If you crossed him, there might be no headline, no trace, just a gap where you used to be. And the money kept flowing. Even in exile, his reach extended into construction contracts, international shipping, and luxury real estate, always through layers, always behind clean names and shell corporations. His control wasn't just in what he owned, but in what others owed him. Debts that could not be written off, favors that outlived generations, fear that was passed down like inheritance. The authorities thought freezing bank accounts would cut the bloodline of power, but Matteo didn't need one account. He needed memory, silence, and the knowledge that anyone could be replaced but not everyone could be trusted. The money was a shadow, and like all shadows, it stayed close, even when you turned to face the light. So, the empire endured. Some pieces were visible, flashy, loud. Others were quiet, buried, or dissolved in acid. And somewhere between the locked vaults and the unmarked graves, Matteo's true wealth remained untouched, not in euros or dollars, but in secrets that would never be confessed, and in fear that never aged. He didn't need to be seen to be heard. Matteo Messina Denaro, the ghost of Sicily, could whisper from the shadows and make men vanish across continents. His instructions weren't shouted in meetings or scribbled on paper. They were passed hand to hand, eye to eye, buried inside innocuous greetings, or slipped into coded language that no outsider could untangle. He issued disappearances the way kings issue decrees quietly, finally, and without apology. A man would open a bakery in Palermo and never bake again. Another would step off a plane in Brussels and never leave the airport. Sometimes they vanished with a scream, other times with a handshake. But the message was always the same. No matter how far you run, you are still within his reach. Matteo didn't need to send soldiers. He sent loyalty, fear, and the promise of consequence. His reach went beyond Italy. He had men in Frankfurt, cousins in Toronto, shadows in Buenos Aires. Some were family, some were ghosts like him, and all of them knew the rules. A favor owed could be called in at any hour. A betrayal could be paid for across oceans. There was a story of a man in Marseille, someone who had once ferried messages, then got greedy. He thought distance would buy him safety. But the sea does not protect you when the tide belongs to someone else. One day, he simply stopped answering his phone. His wife said he went to the grocery store and never came home. His name was never on the news, but within certain circles, everyone knew. That was how Matteo worked. He didn't send a message to the world, he sent a message to the few who mattered. Even the logistics had elegance. Boats that left without manifests, trucks that traveled empty but returned full, men who switched names more often than they changed clothes. If a job had to be done in Romania, the signal might begin in Naples. If it ended in silence, Matteo had spoken. And always, the trail was cold. Not because no one searched, but because they searched too late. The moment a disappearance happened, the chain was already dissolved, each link discarded like an old passport. The only consistent feature was the fear, rippling outward from a single command, uttered by a man whose face few had seen in decades. He didn't need borders. He needed belief. Belief that if he wanted you gone, you would be. And that belief alone was power greater than a bullet, quieter than a prayer. They began to whisper it not long after he vanished. He might be the last of the ones who came up through blood and silence, the last who knew the smell of gun oil and the weight of loyalty. Matteo Messina Denaro, they said, wasn't just hiding. He was closing a chapter of history that would never be written again. Cosa Nostra had changed. The old meetings in lemon groves, the messages in handkerchiefs, the oaths made in candlelit rooms, all of it began to fade. But Matteo carried it with him, like an ember from a fire no longer burning. He didn't use encrypted apps. He didn't rant on cameras. He moved in shadows and expected those around him to do the same. To many, that made him the last real one. There were younger men, ambitious, reckless, loud. But they belonged to another world. A world of wiretaps and selfies. Matteo was something else. He was a ghost with a crown, a myth in motion. People swore they saw him at train stations. Others said he drank espresso in Milan dressed as a priest. Some believed he'd had plastic surgery. Others claimed he hadn't changed a thing because no one would dare look twice. And the longer he stayed gone, the larger he became. Mothers in Sicily warned their children, "Behave, or the boss will come for you." Politicians spoke his name like it was folklore, half dreading and half longing for the days when men like him ran things with brutal clarity. Even in courtrooms, defendants would drop his name in hopes of fear seeping into the judge's spine. He became more than a criminal. He became a symbol, a riddle, a reminder of what the mafia used to be: tight, disciplined, terrifying, the kind of thing that didn't beg for headlines but left behind bodies and whispers. And as the years passed, that myth only hardened. Matteo Messina Denaro, the man who vanished into smoke and still ruled from the mist. He was not like the flashy narcos or the boastful dons. He did not build empires on Instagram. He built silence. But myths are heavy. They cannot eat, they cannot sleep, and those who carry them must do so until the weight breaks them or until they vanish entirely. Still, to the old men in back rooms and the watchers behind mirrored windows, he was something sacred, a relic, a warning, the last boss of the old world, and maybe, just maybe, the last one who understood what fear really meant. In the alleyways of Castelvetrano, some still speak his name with a strange mixture of awe and nostalgia. They tell tales of Matteo Messina Denaro slipping envelopes of cash to widows, paying for a child's surgery, or feeding a family whose father disappeared quiet. Anonymous gestures whispered about like blessings from a ghost. To those who believed in such stories, he was the Sicilian Robin Hood, a man who stood against the state but never turned his back on his people. But legends lie, or worse, they distract, because for every story of kindness, there is another of cruelty. Not the loud kind, not the showy kind, but the sort that leaves a silence so thick it stifles the air. There were men who vanished after midnight knocks, farmers whose land changed hands overnight, young boys found in ditches, their bodies broken, not by fate but by orders. Orders some say came from a man who smiled while issuing death. He knew how to cultivate both fear and devotion. That was his talent. He gave just enough to the right families so that their loyalty became a cage. He punished just harshly enough that others would speak for him in trembling voices, even when he was nowhere near. Journalists tried to paint the picture cleanly. Was he a monster or a protector? But Sicily doesn't do clean lines. It does shadow. It does rumor. It does memory in fragments. And so his myth doubled back on itself, one moment a savior, the next a butcher. Mothers blessed him, but also kept his name from their children's mouths. Priests prayed for his soul but didn't ask too many questions when donations appeared. The truth? Maybe both stories are real. Maybe the man who once paid for a sick girl's medicine was the same one who ordered a man's hands broken with hammers. Maybe he believed that justice belonged to him alone, and that love and violence were tools from the same toolbox. And maybe that's why the legend endures. Not because he was kind, not because he was cruel, but because he was both, and neither. A man made of contradictions, a ghost dressed in flesh. A myth that cannot be pinned to one truth, because he never lived in a world where truth stood alone. He gave people something to believe in, and something to fear. And sometimes, in Sicily. Those are the same thing. Somewhere between the truth and the terror, Matteo Messina Denaro became something else entirely, an idea. The longer he stayed hidden, the more the world filled in the silence with stories. They gave him different faces, different accents, even different motives. And soon, the man who walked in shadows became the subject of headlines, crime dramas, and late-night bar whispers. Not just feared, not just hunted, imagined. The tabloids called him the Devil of Trapani, the Phantom of Palermo, the Last Godfather. They ran grainy photos of men in sunglasses, circled faces in markets, and whispered that he had dined in Rome last week, or London the month before. They described his rumored mistresses, his secret plastic surgeries, his luxury hideouts. Every photo blurred, every detail uncertain. But it didn't matter. People wanted a villain they could point at or a legend they could adore. Films came next. Not documentaries, but fiction with the thinnest veil. A slick anti-hero with designer suits and cold eyes. A ghost who loved his mother but buried enemies in lime pits. They shaped him into a character, a man who killed without blinking but kissed children on the forehead. A contradiction that only cinema could polish. And the public? They ate it up. Young men in Naples took selfies with graffiti that read, "Matteo Lives." Tourists asked guides in Palermo where the mafia still met. Songs referenced his name, as if he were just another rebellious spirit. Even those who lost family to mafia violence found themselves caught in the undertow of the myth, because myths are easier than grief. Myths have symmetry, reality does not. Matteo himself, if he watched, must have laughed. Or maybe he stayed silent, knowing that every rumor only helped him vanish further. A man hunted for decades, yet turned into merchandise and meme. He no longer had to hide in the dark. The fantasy version of him kept everyone's eyes looking in the wrong direction. The strangest part? Some people began to forget the blood. They remembered the elegance, the codes, the mystery. They forgot the car bombs, the shootings, the families shattered. They remembered the myth. And myths don't have victims, they have followers. In the end, Matteo Messina Denaro became less a man and more a mirror. People saw in him what they wanted to see: fear, power, rebellion, tragedy. And in doing so, they gave him the greatest gift a ghost could ever receive. They kept telling his story, even after they forgot why they were afraid in the first place. They called him the ghost Italy couldn't kill, and for 30 long years, that name fit too well. He didn't just vanish, he dissolved. Through crackdowns, wiretaps, informants, and 100 coordinated raids, he always stayed a step ahead. Every time the state thought it had him surrounded, he was already gone. Not just hiding behind walls, but inside a system that protected him like a prince cloaked in fog. Governments rose and fell. Ministers gave speeches. Millions were spent. Whole task forces were formed with names like Invisible Hunt and Operation Ghost Trail. Each effort launched with hope, but ended with silence. Frustration built like steam inside a kettle. Every year, it got louder. How could one man outwit a nation? How could one face barely seen mock the justice of an entire republic? They tried everything. Surveillance drones buzzed above Sicilian hills. Agents posed as deliverymen and shepherds. They tracked mailboxes, intercepted dental records, froze assets. But Matteo had built something more powerful than an escape route. He had built a culture, one made of silence, fear, loyalty, and old blood oaths. He was not just protected by people, he was protected by belief. And still, victims' families waited. Year after year, they stood outside courtrooms, clutching fading photos of fathers, sons, daughters. They knew he was out there, living, aging, laughing. It was not the blood that haunted them, it was the absence. The emptiness of knowing the killer was still breathing free air while they lit candles beside gravestones. Inside the police headquarters of Palermo and Rome, maps covered with pins told a story of almosts. Informants gave just enough to stay useful, but never enough to close the net. The few who did break ranks died suddenly, some by their own hand, some by accident, others by something no one could quite explain. And in the silence that followed each dead lead, Matteo became more untouchable. Italy changed in those decades. Politicians shifted, cities grew, technology exploded, but one name never left the national conversation. It lurked on television, in newspapers, in jokes and whispers. The frustration turned into a kind of national shame. How could the mafia outlast reform? How could a man who had ordered bombings and bearings still be sipping espresso somewhere in Sicily? He was not just a fugitive. He was a symbol, a scar that refused to heal, a reminder that for all the strength of law, sometimes shadows win. And for 30 years, that shadow had a name Italy could never quite catch, never quite silence: Matteo Messina Denaro. It came folded inside a plain white envelope. No return address, no fingerprints, just a postcard. A photograph of a seaside village, sunlight brushing terracotta rooftops, boats rocking gently in blue water. On the back, a message scrawled in neat cursive: "Wish you were here, but you're not, M." No one had any doubts. It was him. The postcard had no true value, at least not in court. But in the quiet rooms of anti-mafia units, it hit like thunder, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. He was alive. He was watching. He was laughing. And he was close enough to tease the people chasing him. That postcard was a whisper from a ghost. For years, investigators had followed shadows, scanned grainy security footage, chased rumors of plastic surgery and bunkers beneath olive farms. And here he was, taunting them with a smirk and a stamp. What they didn't know then, but would learn later, was that Matteo had sent more than one, sometimes to journalists, sometimes to politicians, sometimes just left behind in rented flats, like fingerprints made of sarcasm. Each message was different, but the tone was the same. I'm untouchable. You're always behind me, and I will never be in the frame when the shutter clicks. But the arrogance, as it so often does, became a breadcrumb. That particular postcard was traced painfully, obsessively. Analysts scoured the print. They studied the angle of the shadows, the build of the homes, the slope of the hill in the background. And little by little, the search began to narrow. The village was somewhere in western Sicily. The photo, it turned out, had been printed at a pharmacy near Campobello di Mazzara. That detail seemed minor, but for the first time in decades, the scent of something real was in the air. Every phone was tapped. Every trash bin was searched. Every car was catalogued. Quietly, patiently. A digital fence was built so slowly it wouldn't startle the deer. The hope wasn't to catch a ghost. It was to force the ghost into showing his reflection. And then, one day, there it was. A man, walking into a clinic for cancer treatment, balding, wearing thick glasses. He gave his name Andrea Bonafide, but the birth date didn't match. The face looked just a bit too nervous. Someone whispered the suspicion. Someone else moved in. For 30 years, he had evaded the world. But in the end, it was the body that betrayed the myth. Not a bullet, not a betrayal, just disease and routine. The ghost had sent one too many postcards. And this time, the reply had already been written. It wasn't a midnight raid or a dramatic standoff. It was a hospital appointment. A man in his 60s walked into the private La Maddalena clinic in Palermo, dressed like any other cancer patient, pale, worn thin, moving with the stiffness of someone who had learned to live with pain. No guards, no entourage, just a quiet man, holding a referral slip in one hand and a name that wasn't his in the other. The alias was Andrea Bonafide. On paper, Bonafide was a real man, born and raised in Campobello di Mazzara. But the man walking through those hospital doors was not him. The birth date on the file didn't match. Neither did the Social Security code. But for nearly a year, no one had noticed. Or rather, no one had dared to believe the impossible. But the impossible had grown tired. Cancer doesn't honor legends. It scrapes away the layers, softens the edges, dulls even the sharpest instincts. For decades, he had lived in mirrors with no reflection, cameras with no image. He had become a whisper, a ghost, a fable used to scare men who thought they were untouchable. But a hospital doesn't work like the underworld. It keeps records. It files insurance. It opens doors with real names. Authorities had begun to tighten the net after months of watching Campobello. Surveillance footage, intercepted chatter, and the slowly forming suspicion that someone important was hiding in plain sight. But it was the hospital visit that brought the entire illusion crashing down. The man had come before, under the same name, same file, same story. But this time, someone on the inside had grown suspicious. Maybe it was the nervous smile. Maybe it was the way he never answered small talk. Or maybe, finally, someone recognized the shadow behind his eyes. A call was made. Quiet, cautious, then another. And by the time he walked out of that clinic, the spell was broken. The car he got into was being tracked. The men watching him didn't move right away. They waited, let it breathe. Then followed him home, not a cave, not a forest, but a modest apartment tucked behind a supermarket. The landlord didn't know who he was. The neighbors had never seen anything unusual, but the investigators knew. They'd seen enough. It was time. That appointment routine, even mundane, wasn't just a checkup. It was the final thread unraveling the myth. No shootout, no farewell. Just doors opening, gloves snapping on, and the quiet click of handcuffs slipping over wrists that once commanded empires. The ghost was real, and this time, he had nowhere left to vanish. It was a Monday, the kind that begins with a half-yawned espresso, a drizzle of winter rain brushing against windshields, and the slow murmur of a city waking up without realizing something historic is about to happen. Palermo stirred like any other morning, fruit vendors setting up stalls, traffic building along Via Libertà, the hospital cafeteria already steaming with bitter coffee. No sirens, no sense of urgency, just another quiet start in Sicily. He stepped outside wearing a brown coat, a woolen hat pulled low, a white surgical mask over his mouth, the same look half the country had adopted since the pandemic swept through. There was nothing in his gait that betrayed who he was. Nothing theatrical, no entourage, not even a bodyguard. Just an aging man going to his oncology appointment. But waiting nearby were men who had spent entire careers chasing this ghost. Generations of officers had passed the file down like a curse, each thinking maybe they'd be the one to catch him, and each watching him vanish again. Now, here he was, not in a bunker, not in a foreign land, but walking calmly through the front doors of a clinic, as if the world didn't remember his name. The agents watched him from a distance at first, confirmed the eyes, the stride, the shape of the ears. The old photos had been studied like scripture, and even after decades, some features never truly fade. But even then, they hesitated. Could it really be him? As he waited for his number to be called, he read a newspaper. Calm, focused, the kind of man used to holding 1,000 secrets beneath a casual glance. But the game was already over. Quiet calls passed between the Carabinieri and the anti-mafia squad. Plainclothes officers moved into position, and then, without drama, they approached him. The moment came with no raised voices, just a whisper, a badge, a question he didn't answer. When they placed the handcuffs on him, he looked straight ahead, not resisting, not protesting. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "You know who I am," he said. And they did. It was an arrest that made headlines around the world. But in that room, it felt like nothing more than an ordinary moment catching up with an extraordinary lie. After 30 years underground, after disguises, betrayals, and death sentences, Matteo Messina Denaro, the last godfather, had walked into the open on his own 2 feet. No shootout, no escape. Just an ordinary morning that ended the longest shadow Italy had ever chased. There was no blaze of glory, no final stand behind a barricade of loyal men, no frantic car chase down the winding roads of Sicily. When the moment came, Matteo Messina Denaro did not reach for a weapon. He did not run. He did not scream. He did not even flinch. It happened in a waiting room, a hospital, where lives begin and end every day. The televisions overhead muttered news no one listened to. A child cried in the corner, and the man who had once ordered bombings that shook the foundations of Italy sat calmly among the sick. As if history wasn't about to lay its hands on his shoulder, the agents moved in slow, not out of fear, but out of reverence for how long this had taken. 30 years of shadows, of wiretaps and dead ends. 30 years of men disappearing, of witnesses too afraid to speak, of judges buried beneath rubble. 30 years of myth narrowed down to one morning and one man. They spoke his name quietly. Not the alias, not the one on the appointment sheet, the real one. The one whispered through courtrooms and safe houses and nightmares. He did not deny it. He looked them in the eye like he'd been expecting them all along. They told him he was under arrest. He nodded. The handcuffs were cold, not cruel, not tight, but final. And still, he made no move to resist. No shouting, no spectacle, no demand for a lawyer. The only sound was the scuff of his shoes on the tile as they guided him out. The people in the room didn't even understand what they'd just witnessed. To them, he had been just another old man with thinning hair, tired eyes, and a medical file tucked under one arm. By the time someone whispered his name, he was already in the car. The news hit like thunder an hour later. The last boss, the ghost, the invisible empire's ruler, caught not in a gunfight, not in a raid, but in line for a doctor's checkup. Some say it was cowardice, that he didn't want to die in a blaze, like those before him. But others knew better. This was control, the same control he had mastered all his life. Even in surrender, he chose the time, the place, the terms. No blood, no bullets, no drama, just silence, as the weight of his crimes stepped into the light and history finally exhaled. The country that once trembled beneath car bombs and funeral bells did not shout when it finally answered. It whispered, but that whisper was steady, firm, and heard across the world. For 30 years, Italy had lived in the long shadow of a man it could not touch, a ghost who mocked every institution built to find him. But ghosts, even the most careful ones, eventually leave footprints. When the news broke, it wasn't just an arrest. It was a reckoning. A message sent not with gunfire, but with handcuffs. For every family that lit a candle beside a ruined church. For every judge who died holding the line. For every child who grew up thinking mafia bosses were untouchable legends, Italy finally whispered back. He was taken not to some remote prison, but to a place guarded by the memory of the fallen. A cell as cold as the lives he vanished. The silence of the room was louder than any courtroom speech. No fanfare, no applause. Just the quiet return of justice delayed, not denied. The men and women who built the case did not wear capes. They wore out their shoes chasing leads that vanished into alleyways and ashes. They sat through nights decoding scraps of paper, watching grainy footage of faceless men in cafes. They listened to hundreds of hours of silence, waiting for a name to fall like a pebble into a still pond. When that ripple finally reached them, they didn't cheer. They simply moved. It wasn't just about Matteo. It was about the country he haunted. A place where corruption once sat beside power, where fear shaped politics, and where too many turned away when it mattered. But times had changed. A new generation had grown up under that weight, and now it pushed back. In the days that followed, reporters scrambled for angles. Politicians gave speeches. Some called it a victory, others a beginning, but for the quiet professionals who never stopped hunting, it was something simpler, a return to balance. Italy did not roar when it found its ghost. It did not need to. The silence of the capture said more than 1,000 arrests ever could. It was the sound of a country reclaiming something it had nearly lost its dignity, and in that quiet, something ancient stirred, a reminder to the world, and to every man who thought himself beyond reach. Even ghosts can be found. Even silence has a voice, and sometimes the whisper of justice is louder than the scream of terror. For 3 long decades, Matteo Messina Denaro had been a silhouette, a whisper behind a curtain, a name passed between frightened lips, a ghost that moved but was never seen. The public knew only fragments. An old photo from his youth, courtroom sketches, the grainy descriptions of informants who hadn't seen him in years. In the absence of truth, a myth had grown, but myths cannot withstand the flash of a camera. And then, it happened. The moment the authorities released his arrest photo, Italy stopped breathing. This was no longer the shadow that haunted Sicily's backstreets or the phantom boogeyman of anti-mafia rallies. This was a man. Older, smaller than imagined. His eyes tired, face weathered, expression unreadable. Not monstrous, not heroic, just human. The image flooded every newspaper, every screen, every cafe conversation. People stared, searching his face for answers. How could this be the man who buried rivals in acid? Who ordered the deaths of judges and children? Who danced through decades of manhunts like a ghost in plain sight? The shock wasn't in what he looked like, it was in how ordinary he appeared. No gleaming villain, no cinematic dawn. Just an aging man in a puffer jacket, glasses perched on his nose, his posture slouched from treatment or time. It unsettled people more than a monster might have, because monsters are easy to hate. But this looked like someone's uncle, a man you might pass in a supermarket and never think twice. But there was something else. Look closely, and you could still see it. The glint, that slight curl of the lip. Not fear, not shame, something else, as though even in custody, he was still telling the world, "You didn't catch me, I let you." It was that look that haunted people most. For the families of the victims, it brought a strange kind of closure, a face to match the wound. For the press, it was a goldmine: photos from the hospital, security footage from the arrest, forensic reconstructions compared to the real man. For law enforcement, it was proof that persistence wins. And for Matteo himself, maybe it was a kind of release, to no longer hide, to let the mask fall. But for Italy, that photo was something deeper. It was a mirror, a reminder of how long silence had ruled, how easily power had slipped into invisibility, and how, sometimes, evil wears a face that blends in with the crowd. The myth had finally been unmasked, and in its place stood a man gray, mortal, and caught. He sat in silence for most of it, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who knew the value of a secret. Matteo Messina Denaro, the last great phantom of Cosa Nostra, had finally been brought in, but he hadn't come to talk, at least, not the way they'd hoped. The state had waited 30 years to ask its questions. But the man they captured wasn't in a hurry to answer. Interrogators approached with care, knowing they weren't just speaking to a prisoner. They were speaking to a living archive of blood deals, betrayals, and billion-lira operations. Denaro had been there through it all, through the killings of judges, the extortion of cities, the slow transformation of the mafia from a brutal street army to a hidden corporate machine. He knew where the bodies were, where the money had gone, and who had helped him vanish. But instead of confessions, they got riddles. He admitted things already known. Yes, he was Matteo. Yes, he had been treated for cancer under a false name. Yes, the documents they found were his. But when it came to the names behind the silence, the men in suits and the ghosts in uniforms, he chose to remain a tomb. There were hints, though. In passing, he'd mention events with too much detail for someone uninvolved. A date, a place, a laugh when someone named a name that wasn't the real one. He toyed with the idea of truth, flicking it like a coin in the air but never letting it land. He knew that knowledge was currency, and he had more than anyone else. Some officers believed he was preparing to negotiate years off his sentence in exchange for names, locations, accounts, but others knew better. This was a man raised in the old code. You never gave away the whole map, especially not to outsiders, especially not to the state, and yet, the pressure built. Investigators reopened cold cases. Families wrote letters begging for answers. Some details leaked mentions of missing children, suspected informants, and crooked officials who might have aided his long escape. A few leads panned out. Most didn't. He died before the real reckoning could begin. When the news came that Matteo Messina Denaro was gone, the air in Italy grew heavier. Not because people mourned him, but because so many questions had just been buried with him. What he knew could have rewritten chapters of Italian history. What he said only scratched the surface, and what he didn't say? That's what still keeps the silence alive. In the end, it wasn't a bullet, a betrayal, or a dramatic shootout that ended his story. It was time, the one enemy even the most ruthless can't escape. Matteo Messina Denaro, once the most feared and wanted man in Italy, faded away not in the streets of Sicily, but within the gray walls of a prison hospital bed. The cell was cold, small, and stripped of any grandeur. No underlings, no whispered commands, no leather chairs or marble statues, just metal, linoleum, and the steady beeping of machines. He'd spent decades controlling empires from the shadows, yet now he couldn't even control his own body. The cancer that had brought him down in the outside world followed him inside. It chewed through him slowly, cruelly, like something that knew it had the last word. Guards rotated in and out, never speaking unless necessary. Doctors checked charts with clinical detachment. He rarely responded. Occasionally, he would glance at them with eyes that had once commanded life and death, but now held nothing but exhaustion. No deals were offered. No visitors wept outside the gates. There was no grand send-off. He had once bragged that he filled cemeteries. Now, he occupied a room that smelled like antiseptic and echoing footsteps. Prison officials said he received care like any other inmate. Food, medicine, monitoring. But everyone knew he wasn't like any other inmate. He was a legend rotting in real time. In those final weeks, he stopped eating, stopped speaking. Some say he stared at the ceiling for hours, not in pain, but in memory. Others believe he never stopped calculating, even with death standing beside him. Maybe he wondered which of his men would try to fill the void, or whether the world outside had already moved on. He died quietly. No final statement, no poetic last breath. Just the slow flicker of monitors going still in the middle of the night. And then, silence. No family claimed the body right away. No masses gathered to mourn. There were no flowers at the prison gate. Only headlines announcing what many had once thought impossible. The ghost had finally vanished for good. Old men die in cells all the time. But when this old man did, the weight of 3 decades shifted. Secrets remained sealed. Questions remained unanswered. But one thing was certain. Matteo Messina Denaro didn't leave in flames. He left in silence. And for a man who once turned that silence into power, it was both a fitting end and a haunting one. There was no thunderclap, no final explosion, no last great escape. The man who had haunted Italy for more than 30 years slipped out of life the way a candle burns low slowly, without ceremony, and in the end, almost gently. Matteo Messina Denaro, the ghost of Cosa Nostra, died of colon cancer in a prison hospital bed under state watch. After decades of vanishing acts, disguises, false names, and myth-making, his last chapter was written in the sterile hum of medical machines. He had once walked the streets of Palermo like a shadow with teeth, untouchable and unseen. His name was passed between trembling lips, his orders carried out across oceans. But when the end came, it was not at the hands of rivals or carabinieri. It was inside his own body, a slow, merciless corrosion, a quiet erasure. Doctors had begun palliative care when treatment stopped helping. No miracles, no more surgeries, just painkillers and silence. There were no last rites read aloud to a mob boss in secret. If he prayed, no one heard it. If he whispered names of enemies, of lovers, of the dead, no one recorded them. And that was the bitter symmetry of it all. He had orchestrated so many deaths, many of them loud and brutal. He had sent car bombs to judges, buried enemies beneath concrete, disappeared witnesses with a nod. And now, the man who filled cemeteries died in a hospital bed, under an assumed name, in the care of the very state he had mocked for years. Word of his death spread in headlines rather than whispers. No gunfire in the streets, no riots, just news anchors reading a statement. Matteo Messina Denaro died during the night. He was 61, and then they moved on. But the silence afterward was strange, a silence that wasn't peace, more like the silence after an earthquake. Because with Denaro went decades of secrets, chains of command, blood debts never paid, and truths that might never be told. Even in death, he kept something. There were questions, of course. Did he talk before the end? Did he name names? Did he confess? Or did he die as he lived, wrapped in shadows, taking everything with him? His remains were not paraded through towns. His funeral was not marked by black suits and weeping women. The ghost simply died. And the question left behind wasn't how he died. It was what he still owned, even in death. Fear, mystery, power. Because even when Matteo Messina Denaro was gone, he wasn't. Some thought his death would be a decapitation. That, with Matteo Messina Denaro gone, the last true dawn of the old world, Cosa Nostra would crumble like a sandcastle beneath the tide. But that's not how these things work. Power doesn't evaporate, it shifts, waits, learns to whisper in different voices. And Denaro, for all his notoriety, was not the whole machine. He was a symbol, not the skeleton. In the months that followed his passing, the state watched closely. Surveillance cameras blinked awake across Sicily. Phones were tapped, accounts were frozen. Men who hadn't spoken aloud in years picked up burner phones and called numbers burned into memory. Denaro's empire didn't collapse. It adjusted. You see, mafia is not a man. It's a system, a culture, a virus wrapped in ritual. And like any organism, it adapts. With Denaro's silence came new voices. Some younger, some less known, but none of them naive. They had watched the ghost rule from the shadows for decades. They learned his lessons. Never write, never trust, never linger. But the question remained, would they hold the same power without the fear he inspired? Denaro had ruled not just with violence, but with myth. He became a story told in hushed tones, a shadow blamed for every whisper of extortion or vanishing. His name alone could freeze a room. His successors had no such myth, just business. And sometimes, that's more dangerous. Authorities hoped his death would open cracks, that someone would defect, flip, testify. But loyalty in that world isn't built on affection. It's built on memory and threat. Those who survived Denaro knew what had happened to those who didn't. That lesson doesn't vanish with a funeral. Still, there were signs of change. The old codes were fraying. Young blood wanted profit, not omerta. They wanted tech, not tradition. Cryptocurrency instead of cash in shoeboxes. And yet, the core remained control, silence, fear. Denaro's death didn't kill the mafia. It only ended an era, a style. Cosa Nostra didn't hold a memorial. There were no tributes carved into marble. But in some cafe in Palermo, someone still pays with a nod. A politician still signs a contract with a shiver in his hand. A shopkeeper still wakes before dawn to find a message tucked under his door. So did the mafia survive him? Ask again in 10 years. But for now, listen to the silence. Because silence, in Sicily, still speaks. Close your eyes. The footsteps in the alley have faded. The whispers behind the market walls have gone still. No more keys turning in unmarked doors. No more envelopes slid under cafe tables. The man they called the ghost has vanished into dust, and with him, the tension that once hung in the air like smoke. For 30 long years, his name was a breath held in the chest of a nation, Matteo Messina Denaro, a name that once made the bold hesitate and the brave go quiet. But now that name has no voice, no footsteps, no orders, no echoes. You are safe. Think of the rooms he once occupied, not grand halls, but small, plain spaces. A bed too neat, a lamp too dim, a face that never met your eyes for too long. That man lived a life in hiding, a ghost afraid of his own reflection, a king without a crown, ruling an empire built on silence. But every reign ends. Every shadow, no matter how long it stretches, eventually breaks under dawn. He died with secrets in his veins and stories in his bones. Some of them he took with him, others will never matter again. What remains is peace. Not justice, perhaps, not yet, but peace, the kind that settles slowly, gently, like fog lifting after a storm, the kind that lets children walk to school without looking over their shoulder, the kind that allows old men to sit outside again and remember without fear what it was like before the shadow fell. Breathe. The ghost is gone. His empire will shift, fracture, fade, or perhaps it will learn new names, new faces. But that part of the story belongs to another time. Not this night, not this moment. Tonight is for rest, for knowing the monster has no teeth left, for understanding that no man, no matter how long he runs, can outrun the ending. Let it go now. Let your heart beat slow. The nightmare has stepped off the stage. The curtain has fallen. Sleep now. The ghost is gone.